thank you very much for this very kind welcome. I haven't said anything yet. It's amazing what impact you can make without saying anything. I've been on the front pages of the press in Britain without having said anything, so we'll see what happens as a result of saying something. Well, it is a great privilege indeed to be part of this miracle of Gafcon. It really is a miracle. How many people have tried to prevent it, but it has not been prevented because it is part of God's purposes for our church. And it is about those purposes that I wish to speak this afternoon. The nature and the future of the Anglican communion. And indeed, the one belongs to the other. The future of the Anglican communion is to be found in its authentic nature, not recently invented innovations and explanations, but what actually belongs to the church as we have always known it. So let us first think about the church and the churches. The New Testament speaks of the church, as you know, in many different ways. There is the church of the household, of Prisca and Aquila, of Nympha, of Lydia. How many women there have you noticed? Of the church at Troas, the church of the household. And of course we know that the household in New Testament times was not the nuclear family of the West. It was rather like the family that many of us know, extended with servants and employees and all sorts of other hangers-on. The church of the household. And that is very important in the New Testament. It is a church of those who are in some way like one another. It has to do with likeness. But then, of course, there is another way in which the New Testament speaks of church, and that is of the church in a particular city or town. Ephesus or Corinth or Rome or Antioch or Jerusalem. This is where people who are different from one another, unlike one another, come together. So if you read the instruction about the supper of the Lord in 1 Corinthians 11, or indeed about the Christian assembly in James 2, it is about the rich and the poor, the old and the young. Galatians 3, men and women, Jew and Gentile, all having to come together and to get on with one another in the service of the Lord. The church of the household, the church in a particular city or town, the church in an area. How much of the New Testament is addressed to the church in a particular area, whether it's Galatia or Asia, or the churches in Judea or Macedonia, wherever it may be. And then, brothers and sisters, there's the worldwide church of God, which is described by St. Paul in the letter to the Galatians as Jerusalem, our mother that is above. The worldwide church, from which, of course, all our churches derive and to which we have to remain faithful. And, of course, all our churches also make up that worldwide church of God throughout the ages and everywhere in the world. Now, what, you will say, has this to do with Anglicanism? Well, at the Anglican Reformation, the church was expressed in two main ways. There was the parish church, which had a responsibility for everyone in the community. So the church was incarnate in every community, And then there was the idea of the national church. At that time, Western Europe was coming to a sense of people being in nation states, and so it was natural that the life of the church should also be expressed in that way, as a national church. What about the church of the household? Well, perhaps it survived in the family prayers, being Christian in the family. And Callum Brown has rightly said, I think, that the demise of Christianity as a public religion in Britain dates from the time when it ceased to be passed on in the family, by the parents. Don't blame anyone else. Of course, the national church itself reflects to some extent the provincial idea, already found in germ in the New Testament, in the churches addressed to a particular region, but so much promoted by the churches of Africa, by Cyprian himself in his relationship with Rome and with other churches. The universal idea of the church as being a universal reality certainly suffered at the Reformation. We have to be frank about this and to admit it, but it survived, I believe, in three main ways. Firstly, in the appeal to Scripture. That is to say that every church, to derive its authenticity, needs to appeal to Scripture as the final authority. Secondly, it survived in the universal appeal to antiquity, that the Church of England was not doing anything new, but was simply continuing with the ancient church of the fathers and the councils. And thirdly, of course, it survived in the hope of a general council which might gather together to settle differences among Christians. We are faced in a changing situation where people want to be church with those who are like them. We find this in Africa, with people wanting to be church in the context of their own tribes. We find it in Asia, and now we find it with the affinity model churches, the network churches, for instance, or the virtual churches in the north. And that will no doubt spread to the south as well. I used to be quite hostile to people wanting to be church with others who were like them, because it could encourage caste-based churches. It could encourage people from one religious background who would become Christian to want to stick with one another. But having looked at the church of the household and the idea that it is possible for people who are like one another to be church has led me to modify my views a little. And I now feel that it is permissible for people to be churches in this sort of way, networked in terms of their profession or their leisure or where they live or whatever else you can think of, their expertise in IT, for instance. But there is one condition, and that is that it is not the only way of being church. If you want to be church with those who are like you, then you also have to be church with those who are unlike you. You have to maintain that tension which is found in the New Testament. The emergence under God of the Anglican Communion as a fellowship of churches has raised again for us, and now in a very sharp way, the question of universality. How do we make the universal church an effective fellowship of believers and of churches? And as you know, historically, the various instruments have developed to do this: the Lambeth Conference, the Office of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Primates Meeting, and the Anglican Consultative Council. But in the crisis that is facing us at this time, we have found these not to be enough, because in the end they were based on English good manners. And we have found that in our world, English good manners are simply not enough. So we have to find another way, while of course respecting the need for good manners. I will come back to that in a moment. So the church and the churches, if you would like to keep that in your mind. And then secondly, communication and culture. We have here among us Professor Lamin Sani. I could see him for a moment, but he's disappeared from view, who is the greatest authority on the relationship between the communication of the gospel and culture that in our generation, I think. And his work on the translatability of the gospel, work that he did first in reflecting on the translation of the Bible into African languages and the impact that translation had on African societies, an impact which those who actually did the translation could not have foreseen. But he has pointed out that the question of translatability is not just about the translation of the Bible into different languages, valuable as that is, but it has to do with the nature of the Christian faith itself. That is to say, that the good news of Jesus Christ is intrinsically translatable from one culture to another. And he points out that even the fact that the New Testament was first written in Greek and not in the Aramaic or the Hebrew of Jesus' time is itself a fact of translation. You begin with translation. And as you know, that it was not for another 100 years or so that the New Testament was translated back into Syriac or Aramaic. This is in contrast, of course, compared with, say, another worldwide religion like Islam. Now, Islam is also universal, of course. You find it in many different parts of the world. But wherever you go, and whatever the local manifestations, there is a certain Arabicness about the Quran, about the prayer, about the call to prayer, which cannot be translated. But the gospel can be and has been throughout the ages. Pope Benedict, in his very important address at Regensburg, which of course drew attention because of what he had said about the relationships between Christians and Muslims, also in this lecture he addressed the question of the relationship between gospel and culture, perhaps a more important aspect of the lecture. In this lecture, Pope Benedict tells us that there was a providential encounter between the gospel and Hellenistic culture, which provided the church with a vocabulary to engage with the Hellenistic world. And he refers to the vision that St. Paul received of people calling him to Macedonia, of the vocation to Europe, therefore, as one aspect of this providential encounter. I doubt personally whether Act 16 will bear the sort of weight that he puts on it. But we can agree with him that the encounter was providential. But at the same time, there were many other encounters going on. I have for long been interested in the story of the church in the Persian Empire, the other great superpower to Rome at that time. And it's a very similar history, brothers and sisters. Armenia was the first country, the first nation to call itself Christian. Ethiopia became a huge Christian empire at about the time of the rise of Islam, and no one can accuse the Ethiopian church of Hellenism. So there have been all these providential encounters, and we thank God for them, and we have to ask what lessons we can learn from them for ourselves today. When we consider the Anglican situation, the translation of the Bible by William Tyndale into English is a landmark, not only in the story of the English church, but of the English nation and of the English language. It is impossible to think of a Shakespeare or a Milton or a Donne without a Tyndale. And the translation, the rendering into the vernacular of the liturgy, of the Book of Common Prayer, of worship in a language understood by the people is all part of this process of translation. This is wealth that we cannot easily give up. And translatability belongs to the very nature of Anglicanism. In the preface to the Book of Common Prayer and the Articles of Religion, every church has a responsibility to render the good news in terms of its culture. There is, of course, a downside to this, and that is that it is possible for the gospel to become so identified with a particular culture that it becomes captive to it. And Anglicanism has been exposed to this danger of capitulation to culture from the very beginning. And wherever we are, in whatever culture we find ourselves, we must be aware of this danger of captivity and capitulation. The other thing, of course, to note is that while our foundational documents may speak of relating the gospel to culture, in fact, we have often failed to do so. And so Anglican Christian churches have not been able to look African or Asian or South American in the way that they should. Well, that brings me then to the question of constancy and change. What is it in this situation of flux that must remain constant? It is, to my mind, the passing on and the receiving and the passing on again of the apostolic teaching. That is how the church lives, that is how the church derives its strength, that is how the church grows. Now, of course, in every culture, in every age, people notice things in that apostolic teaching which others have not noticed, or which we have forgotten or neglected. And so that aspect of the apostolic teaching can be recovered. It is also true, and Archbishop Orombi was kind to point out that I had worked with the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, and I sense the truth of this very much at that time. It is also true that the church is faced with new knowledge. And how do we relate this unchanging apostolic teaching to new knowledge? We now know far more about the early embryo, for instance, than people did even 50 years ago, or even 30 years ago. And so we must have a healthy view of relating this apostolic teaching to change. There must be the possibility of development in terms of our doctrine. However, what I would want to say is that this development has to be principled. As John Henry Newman pointed out in his thinking on this issue, any development of this kind must have a conservative action on the past. It must conserve the vigor of the gospel. It must represent a continuity of principles. It must provide a basis for change that is not simply laxity and giving in. When any question arises as to whether something is an authentic expression of the apostolic teaching or not in such changing circumstances, then we have to test it against the Bible. Because the Bible is the norm by which we appreciate what is authentically apostolic. That is the reason for the Bible being the ultimate, the final authority for us in our faith and our life. And this is, of course, the reason why Anglicans have taken the study of the Bible so very seriously. You study something because you regard it as important, not because you regard it as unimportant. In the study, again, there are a number of aspects to it, to which I want to draw your attention. The first is the study of what lies behind the text. Why was a particular text put together? What were the purposes of those who were writing it? What were the oral traditions that lay behind it? We are all used to studying the Bible in that way. What is behind the text? What is in the text? A careful study of the grammar, of the literary value of the books of the Bible. And then, of course, what is in front of the text, how we relate the Bible to our circumstances, our culture, our context, our situation. This process of inculturation must go on, of course. But there are two important things to be said about it. First of all, there are limits to this process. It can't just take place anyhow. And the limits have to do, first of all, with the nature of the gospel itself. Whatever the process of inculturation does or does not do, it cannot compromise how God has revealed his purposes to us, how Jesus Christ has come in the flesh, what he has done, who he is. All of that cannot be obscured by the process of inculturation. Secondly, the process should not in any way impair the fellowship that there is between Christians. So my inculturation where I am cannot be such that you fail to recognize the authentic gospel in my church, and vice versa, of course. We can talk about inculturation also in terms of rendering the mind of Christ or the mind of the Scriptures in terms of a particular culture or people, to make something intelligible to people, inspiring for them, authoritative for them, so that they may live their lives by it. And so we come to the question of how fellowship is maintained, how it is enhanced and not impaired, and to the question of communion and conflict. Unity is a very precious thing indeed. What a good and joyful thing it is when brothers and sisters live together in unity, the Bible tells us. And we must seek to maintain that unity and that peace which builds unity. And there must be unity in diversity. We are not all the same, we are not all the same, we are not all the same. We are all different. You remember that story about Selby Taylor, the great Archbishop of Cape Town, who was a single man and very shy, and he was asked to address the Mothers' Union. So when he got up to speak, I think some people know the joke here already. When he got up to speak, he wanted to put the Mothers' Union at ease and also himself. And he said, "Ladies, I would like you to know that underneath this cassock, you and I are exactly the same." But it's not like that, is it? We are all different, and this unity is a unity in diversity. But it has to be, and this is something that is a matter for discussion. It has to be legitimate diversity, not just any kind of diversity. I asked John Stott once, I said to him, "You told us many years ago to stay in the Anglican Church because it was comprehensive. What do you say now?" And he said, "Well, I've always believed in principled comprehensiveness." I think that is another good phrase, principled comprehensiveness. William Reed Huntington, the American Episcopalian theologians, and yes, there were some, I hope there are some still, distinguish between what he called the Anglican principle and what he called the Anglican system. Well, the Anglican system we are all aware of, spires and fluttering surplices and choirs singing and archdeacons and so forth. I know there are some archdeacons here. You might say bishops. But if that's the system, what's the principle? The principle, he said, was the responsibility and the privilege of the local church to be and to become the Catholic Church in that place. Every local church. But Huntington was a good enough ecumenist, even in his day in the 19th century, to know that a local church could not be the Catholic Church in its place without being in relationship with all the other local churches. He anticipated the New Delhi statement by about 100 years. How then is the local church to be the Catholic Church in relationship with all other local churches so that they can also be the Catholic Church in that place? That is the question. Huntington, of course, attempted to answer this by developing what has now come to be called the Chicago-Lambeth Quadrilateral. That is to say, there were at least 4 things that were necessary for us to recognize the church in one another: the supreme authority of the Scriptures, the Catholic creeds, the sacraments instituted by Christ himself, and the historic ministry of the church. And that quadrilateral has been hugely important in Anglican discussion with other Christians. Many of the plans for church union, not least in India, Pakistan, and Ceylon, as it then was, could not have been conceived without the quadrilateral playing a major part in this. But apart from being significant ecumenically, it is also good shorthand for Anglican identity. Anglicans have tended to say, if people have asked them, what are you about? And that's quite often a justifiable question. They've said, this is what we are about, the quadrilateral. But again, the quadrilateral has not proved enough in our circumstances. I have spoken already about the instruments of communion, of the necessity of why they arose, and of their inadequacy now. So what else do we need to do to make sure that we continue to live in communion and do not perpetuate conflict that is unnecessary in the church? I believe there are some things that do need attention. The first is that we have to be clear that we are a confessing church. Some people have the mistaken idea that Anglicans can believe anything, or sometimes even that Anglicans believe nothing. I don't know which is more serious. We have to be clear that we are a confessing church articulating the gospel in terms of our own tradition. Secondly, to be a confessing church effectively, we need to be a conciliar church. That is to say, we need to have councils at every level, including the worldwide, that are authoritative, that can make decisions that stick. In the last few years, I've been frustrated by decision after decision after decision that has not stuck. And we cannot have this for the future for a healthy church. And then thirdly, we need to be in our councils consistorial. That is to say, the councils themselves or through their representatives need to exercise the authority of a teaching office. In particular circumstances, not every day, not promiscuously, but in particular circumstances, the faith has to be articulated clearly for the sake of people's spiritual health and for the sake of mission. Now, there is both, of course, the need for continuity and the need to recognize our context, brothers and sisters. Successive Lambeth conferences have said that the Anglican Communion is willing to disappear in the cause of the greater unity of Christ's church, to make that sacrifice. And of course, we should continue to affirm that. If it is necessary for the Anglican Communion to die so that the gospel may live, well, so be it. But before we jump to too many conclusions about this, we have also to acknowledge that there are things in the Anglican tradition that we can offer as a service and as a gift to the worldwide church. The vernacular liturgy and its beauty, the way in which we think theologically, the way in which people are formed, the musical traditions of the church, the way in which Catholic order has been expressed, particularly in an Anglican form. We would not like to lose these things, but to offer them to the wider church, as indeed we have done ecumenically for the last 100 years or more. But there is also the context. And whilst we value the continuity, we also have to be clear that the church and its life needs to be expressed effectively in a plural world, in a globalized world, where private deals cannot carry credibility indefinitely, and where we have to be clear with our neighbors what gospel it is that we have. Because a gospel that is not the gospel of Jesus Christ, people quickly rumble what we are trying to do if we are trying to deceive people with something that is not the gospel of Christ. So continuity and a changing context have to be held together. And then finally, commission and the coming days. If we are about anything, we should be about mission. The Great Commission and its continuing validity for the church. A journalist rang me up the other day and he said, Bishop, do you believe in witnessing to people of other faiths? And I said, of course I do. And he said, does that include Muslims? And I said, of course it does. And the headlines the next day was, Bishop wants to convert Muslims. Well, fair enough. I mean, that's not the only thing I want to do with Muslims, but I have an obligation. I have an obligation to witness to all that God has done in Jesus Christ for me, for you, for the world, even for Muslims. Praise the Lord. And I am not apologetic about it. But the Great Commission has to be carried out in every context, and perhaps the greatest challenge that we have is that of a militant secularism, which is creating a double jeopardy for Western cultures, that the West is losing the Christian discourse at the very time when it needs it most. Well, let us pray that we are able to recover the Christian nerve in the West and to make sure that the gospel is not lost, and so that all that is of value, of positive value in Western culture, which largely depends on its Judeo-Christian heritage, that will serve as a way of enhancing and as a way of prospering cultures in the West, of renewing them once again. But in every context, mission remains important as we seek to serve people, as we are present with them, as we identify them, as we challenge them, as we have dialogue with them, and as we seek to serve them. But this commission has to take place within movements of renewal. One of the things that we really need to beware of is over-institutionalizing the church, because it is that which has led to the present crisis. People who are in love with the institutions and structures of the church rather than with the Lord Himself. There have been great moments in Christian history when there have been movements of renewal. The monastic movement, when the church had become lax and corrupt and rich, the monks went out into the deserts of Egypt and of Syria and of Mesopotamia to purify and to renew the church. And what a great renewal that was. Pope Benedict said at Regensburg that important things in Christian history had happened in Europe, except, he said, for some important developments in the East. Well, one of them was monasticism, which Athanasius, of course, when he came to exile in the West, brought with him. A significant development indeed. The great missionary societies. When the Church Mission Society, of which I was General Secretary, was formed 200 years and more ago, it took the Archbishop of Canterbury 2 years even to reply to their letter asking for permission to be set up. But that did not prevent God's work, brothers and sisters. It did not prevent God's work. And CMS, under God's providence, was responsible for so many who are here and for your churches. Today also we seek such movements of renewal for the sake of mission. And if you are anything gathered here together, you are the beginnings, in miraculous beginnings we can even say, of an ecclesial movement for the sake of the gospel and for the renewal of Christ's church. That is my prayer for you. I think that should be your prayer for yourself. Thank you very much indeed.